In this roundup of a week, a big part of the world remains in lockdown, but already there are mixed messages about whether people's resolve will hold the course. Environmentalists blunder straight into making disastrous comparisons between the response to a pandemic and what they want to have happen on climate change. And new research suggests that the global ocean circulation is speeding up, contrary to previous reports that it was slowing down. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Change Makers. Welcome to another exciting week in the worldwide experiment that is 2020. I hope you've avoided, and if not avoided, then at least tamed, the coronavirus since last time. This in a week where we've learned that the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson and the heir to the British throne, the Prince of Wales, have both come down with COVID-19. Large numbers of people have been staying at home, and large amounts of cash have been thrown about by governments to try to keep those people solvent while they stay at home. People are worried about just how out of control things could get, with the big fear being that health services could become swamped, leading to much higher death rates due to the lack of proper ICU places. But others are also starting to worry about just how huge the economic impact of all of this is going to be, and suggesting that the harm to people may be a lot bigger from that element over the next couple of years even than the immediate medical crisis. And this raises an interesting and rather important question. Right now, the compliance with the various government's restrictions, to the degree that they exist, and it mostly exists to a fairly high degree, is held together by what might be described as the war spirit. We saw an example of that in the UK yesterday, when the government called for volunteers to support the National Health Service and received nearly 500,000 volunteers in one day. Whatever analysis you choose to take on this whole crisis, that alone is a figure that I draw immense strength from and makes me proud of my country that such a spirit is so strong. And you can add to that the moment this week where citizens across the country stood outside their front doors and applauded and made noise for all of the National Health Service workers in the front line. It's something to put into context the more scattered reports of idiots ignoring the social distancing instructions and even real morons doing things like deliberately coughing in the faces of older people. Yes, at a moment of crisis you get both extremes, but just compare the numbers between the two and it's still something to be celebrated. I was picking up medicines and provisions for self-isolating friends today, and both at the clinic and at the supermarket you now found people in a stoical and cautious mood, pretty much bought into the new realities. The question is, how long can that last? And will it last longer in some countries than in others? And should it? We know that we expect to see the curve, however flat we manage to get it in the end, but at some point it will level off and start to decline. Where is the point in that decline where it becomes the optimum balance between getting the country moving again and setting off a lift in new cases of COVID-19? The closer we get to that point, the more fiercely people will be debating where the point is, and even if our leaders judge it absolutely perfectly, they'll be surrounded by people telling them they went too soon and others telling them they left it too late. Boris Johnson, assuming he emerges from his own close encounter in good health, will probably be able to shrug off that inevitable criticism. He's in a pretty strong position and he's generally getting support for the effort so far. President Trump is in a completely different position and he knows it. Right now, Trump is talking about what a beautiful time Easter is, and wouldn't it be great if everyone could be headed back to work at Easter? There are two versions of what he might be doing here. If you assume Trump is an idiot, which many people do, then you're probably sitting there thinking, oh my God, he's going to tell everyone to come out and go to work at Easter and there's going to be carnage across the land as a result. And maybe. You can never quite count it out with Trump. But I think he's playing a slightly smarter game than that. He knows there's going to be a lot of damage to the economy, and that means to the well-being of all those people he's counting on for support. I think he wants them to see him straining at the bit to get the jobs back up and running again. He wants them to know that although circumstances prevented it, He was on their side. He was desperate to get things back to normal so they could avoid the worst effects. And if Joe Biden says anything, as you would expect, pushing back against Trump's rhetoric, then he will probably have ammunition to use against him. You may be hurting, but with Sleepy Joe, it would be a lot more. That's what I think he's doing. And it may or may not work. I still think that when the full depth of the crisis hits, people might shift significantly to the person that they see as a safe pair of hands, which will partly depend, I suspect, on who Joe Biden picks as his vice presidential running mate, because it will be on everybody's mind that either of these two candidates could be in trouble if they catch the disease, but Biden comes across certainly as more delicate in that scenario. I don't think it'd be a great recommendation that he pick Hillary Clinton, let's just put it that way. But even with all that said, Trump is still sure to look to relax controls at the earliest opportunity that a case can reasonably be made for it. And the fact that he's seen to do that will either put pressure on other leaders around the world or possibly even ease pressure on them if after a couple of weeks it's clear that the move has either been very successful or very disastrous. Either of them will probably take the pressure of uncertainty off their shoulders. But Trump probably also knows that his country is the least likely of almost any country to stick to the restrictions long term, and particularly amongst the base of his own supporters. All those years of feeding the hostility and suspicion towards big federal government, all that individualism, all those people whose justification for owning guns is that you never quite know when one day the feds might come over to impose tyranny on you. I mean, don't get me wrong, Americans can have a great community spirit. They can pull together in a crisis in a really impressive way. But if any specific type of crisis was really going to test that ability, it would be something like this, that without a physical enemy hurling bombs at you, nevertheless, you have to cede to the federal government telling you all the things that you're no longer allowed to do. And in that context, if the president keeps saying as well that this is all going to be over soon, we mustn't let the cure be worse than the disease, it's almost custom built for people not to take the constraint seriously enough to hold rigid for several months or more. I mean, in the UK and most other governments, it's been the case that on the basic operation of controlling the crisis, governments have had cooperation from their political opponents, which is what happens in a crisis. Everyone buries their political differences. In the US, you had the $2 trillion support package for the American people held up because the partisans couldn't put aside that partisanship. Having done all the bipartisan work to create the bill in the first place in various committees, you then had Nancy Pelosi coming in and throwing that out and trying to inject a bunch of measures, including measures on climate change. Whether you think the US should be passing measures on climate change or not, and I do, you certainly shouldn't be trying to do it in that bill. And I know the other side will have their excuses and their justifications, and I know the original bill will have had various flaws that you can point at. It's the fact that people thought all of those things were more important than getting the job done that is the most outstanding thing. If the political leadership of the country can't pull itself together, then it seems likely that the rest of the country will respond accordingly. And indeed, one of the most startling graphs that I've seen this week has been this one, suggesting that concern over coronavirus, just as for the concern over climate change, falls significantly along party lines in the US. Now, I find that baffling. I mean, utterly baffling. But it does lend credence to the suspicion that maybe Trump true believers will be the ones to break formation early, especially if the manoeuvrings this week from Pelosi et al. Starts to feed the idea that just like climate change, this is a hoax whipped up to bring in socialism by the back door. If I'm right, and I really hope I'm not, there's a chance that America is about to show the world how not to deal with a pandemic. Lack of discipline amongst the troops never won a war. Maybe not if we get to learn the lesson of China. I mean, we don't quite know what that lesson is just yet. But lots of people think the communist government there has been covering up a second wave as they've relaxed restrictions. And I saw today that apparently having opened a number of cinemas, they've now closed them again, which kind of tells you something's up. I hesitate to say it, and it's very early days. But maybe COVID-19 will end up being the making of this generation. For many decades now, we've had successive generations raised free from real problems. And I mean the get in the trenches and fight or die type problems. And as a result, we've ended up with an increasingly fragile and delicate mindset. People benefiting from the miracle of air travel, but just whining about the Wi-Fi not working, for instance. People getting offended by everything, fighting fights about non-existent microaggressions or worse. I say this with all respect to the personal tragedies of everyone who gets directly influenced and affected by this pandemic. Maybe this was the wake-up call that we as a human species needed. A taste of the fact that ultimately what unites us is really much more important than what divides us, that actually we need to work out how to make ourselves as individuals and as communities more resilient, not just more comfortable. What lessons will we have learned from this at the end of the day? Will it change our day-to-day assumptions about what's a sensible way to behave? The generation that came through the Second World War was the generation that 20 years later still didn't waste anything. Rationing and shortages had taught them the value of small things and frugal economics, as well as the importance of friends and family. It won't be an identical lesson, but maybe, surely, we will carry something long after the crisis has come to an end. Hopefully it'll be something a little bit more profound than the stricture of having 3 months' worth of toilet rolls in storage at all times. Of course, one thing that has been universally true is that governments have been treating this situation as a crisis, one where you mobilise all the resources of society to support the end goal. And it's also been the case that many environmentalists have been observing all that mobilisation and political will and getting a bit, shall we say, miffed. Because in their view, this is exactly the scale of mobilisation that should have been happening over climate change over these recent years. And in various ways, they've been making this view felt. TV journalist John Simpson tweeted this: "When the coronavirus is over, we'll remember there's something infinitely worse and more destructive hanging over us, the threat to our planet. If we can lock down for a disease, can we not work together to do what's necessary to save ourselves from becoming disaster?" That was a relatively mild version. The most irritating ones were probably the ones that put forward the phrase silver lining. This one was typical. There is always a silver lining in the darkest of clouds. In the present world lockdown because of coronavirus, many millions of vehicles, ships, aircraft, machinery and other pollution-generating items have come to a halt. Will it help controlling climate change effects? Which gets rather close to celebrating the outbreak. This one gets even closer. This pandemic may have arrived to save our planet, but will we follow up with action? The one that became semi-viral was actually an extremely unfortunate poster that was publicised by an apparently maverick individual identifying with Extinction Rebellion. "Corona is the cure. Humans are the disease." That took off particularly when high-profile broadcaster Andrew Neil registered his disgust at it, assuming it was an official Extinction Rebellion message. Extinction Rebellion themselves quickly disavowed it and claimed that the Twitter account was in the control of a far-right group that was using it to discredit them, which was a bit weird because a review of the account's timeline before it was brought down by Twitter had mostly tweets and retweets of standard Extinction Rebellion material from over the last year. And it also had one tweet in support of a prominent Labour figure who was being harassed by the far right. So it seems rather more likely that it was one of the occasional oddballs that such campaigns attract than it was some organised malicious attempt to discredit them. Of course, if it's the oddball who up until that point was working within the spirit of XR, then all that's encouraged by the group's decentralised approach. Doesn't mean they can't disavow them if they do something truly dumb. But let's be clear, lots of people believe this poster was genuine. You have to ask, why was that? Why was it so easy to believe? And the answer, of course, was that they believed it because it seemed like the sort of thing that could easily have genuinely come from people with Extinction Rebellion's worldview. The fact that should be given such a wide perception should give you pause for thought if you're in that particular camp. In any case, it wasn't an official message. End of story. All of these messages are truly misguided and counterproductive. The pandemic didn't arrive to save the planet. It arrived to kill your grandparents, or maybe even your parents. And those suggesting that the measures being taken right now should be very similar to measures that we should take longer term on climate change, those people have no idea what's coming over the next couple of years in terms of pain for vast numbers of people from the hangover of this economic shutdown. Associating the two in people's minds is not going to play to your advantage as those consequences play out. There'll be so many better tacks you could take, focusing, for instance, on the fragility of the system and the need to build much stronger resiliency in the face of various shocks that might be waiting down the line. That would be potentially a winning message, but the environmentalist mainstream message tends to be about avoiding risk, not building resiliency, so they won't take that tack. And of course, the real reason why people have not been responding in the same way to this particular crisis that they do to the standard environmentalists is that there is no suggestion here that people are doing anything other than coming together and doing practically in the short term what needs to be done. Whereas the suspicion for an awful lot of people, particularly on one side of a political perspective, is that actually the bulk of the things that are being put forward by the activists in the name of climate change are actually ones that are fitting a particular political perspective and a particular political agenda. And that then gives you a wholly different situation in terms of the ability to communicate with people and build a consensus, because you're not starting from a common platform. In the meantime, we continue to see signs of our changing natural world, and it continues to surprise us, catch us out, and leave us somewhat baffled. A new study was published this week suggesting that global ocean circulation is speeding up, which is sort of interesting. And it's also slightly startling because previous studies and particularly previous predictions had been that the global ocean circulation would be slowing down, and that the slowdown could be one of the trigger points for consequences following from climate change, with the oceans becoming more stratified and stable with less mixing. So water is continually flowing around the Earth. It distributes heat from one place to another. It distributes dissolved gases such as CO2, which is more easily absorbed in colder conditions and then transported widely across the globe. And although the North Atlantic has indeed been showing a decelerating trend, which is one of the reasons why researchers have been talking about it as a phenomenon, worldwide, the researchers have now discovered is that there's a surprising, significant acceleration of global mean circulation during the past 2 decades. This was particularly prominent in the tropical oceans, apparently. The likely cause of this is increasing surface wind speeds. In terms of the impact, Gail Forget of MIT, who wasn't involved in the study directly, said this: "If the large-scale planetary transports are increasing, that could play a role in modulating climate heat uptake. As a general trend, more turbulence would probably increase the uptake of anthropogenic heat." He added that such circulation wasn't necessarily good or bad news. There are always winners and losers in these situations. However, some climate skeptics jumped on the news with glee, and it really brings home the damned if you do, damned if you don't nature of this discussion. There are some people who would have you believe that climate scientists are always out there faking the figures to fit their narrative. They would say that if data appeared that seemed to contradict the story, then they would quietly change the data. And in my recent video, the first part of How to Think About Climate Change, I talk about the scientific mindset of being excited when new information emerges that forces you to rethink something you already know, which is the direct contradiction of the previous idea. And when I look at this instance, I see that all over it. For instance, Jolan Russell, the geoscientist at the University of Arizona, who wasn't involved in the study as well, said this: "This is quite an exciting paper. I think the results are robust, I think they're important, and I think they are a little shocking." The skeptics have been using it to suggest clearly they don't know what they're doing, which is something you could say every single time new data challenges the previously understood science. In all fields, it happens all the time. I'm interested in what the new information means. I'm happy it gets published and discussed. And I certainly recall some of the catastrophists arguing that the ocean circulations coming to a halt was one of their doomsday scenarios. Well, any new information that confirms such speculations are unlikely to hold water, sorry for the pun, has got to be good. Anyway, I'm out of time for this week. Stay safe as always. My name is Mallen Baker. This is The Mallen Baker Show.